Hey everybody. So here we are getting a chance to talk a little bit more about reconstruction. You've been doing some work on this unit on your own and hopefully getting a sense and an idea of what this period was all about. And I want to review what you should have been able to get out of it so far. So on this first slide here, that's what we have, just a little review. Then I'll get into what I want to cover new in this short video. But you should have already gained some understanding of what the Reconstruction period is and the term Reconstruction itself. When you hear that word, it's the time period after the Civil War. And technically the time period goes from 1865 when the war ends to 1877, which I'll get to later in this video. That time period after the Civil War, those years, is the time period when our country was trying to adjust. And the big question was, how are we going to adjust to this new situation that's been created by this terrible, devastating war? Adjust to all of the new conditions that have been created. The country is in shambles because of just the physical destruction. Think about what you learned about Sherman's march across Georgia and things like the siege at Vicksburg and what happened there. I mean, those places were totally destroyed and had to be rebuilt. We also know that there's all kinds of different things going on between the cultures of the North and the South. Things that we talked about before the war, during the war, well, they're still there after the war. So and then the big one is, and we'll talk a little bit about that in this lecture too, the fact that we now have millions of formerly enslaved people now no longer slaves. That is a major adjustment that our country is going to have to try to figure out how to adjust to. So you should have gone through and learned a little bit about the different plans that were put in place to try to make these adjustments. You learned a little bit about Lincoln's plan and how forgiving it was and how basically it was really a simple, easy way to try to transition back to normal life. We know that he doesn't make it through the war because he's assassinated to put his plan into effect. So that means that Johnson has to take over. When President Johnson starts to institute his plan, same thing. It's real easy, it's real soft on the Southerners. And really with Johnson's plan, and it may have been the case with Lincoln's plan, but we'll never know, but with Johnson's plan, ultimately what you should have learned is that the Southerners started to take advantage of how easy it was. They started to do things to comply with the plan, but also try to reestablish, a white dominant rule in the South and make sure that, African Americans aren't free, but we're certainly not going to treat them as equals. And so Johnson's plan was taken advantage of by many of the Southerners in the Southern states. And that's when we get into that radical Republican plan. The radical Republican plan, once they were able to gain power and kind of take it out of the hands of President Johnson, was designed to try to, stop that Southern ability to take advantage of what was happening. And so the radical Republicans said, you know what, we're going to put a plan into place that's going to do two things. We are going to guarantee that we punish the Southerners for what they have done because they are responsible for the war, at least that was their viewpoint, and we are going to do something to guarantee that African Americans get the rights that they deserve as people living in this country. Under Johnson and Lincoln's plan, there was no real plan to make those things happen. The radical Republicans said we're going to do it. All right, so that's what you've covered up to this point. And you also did a little work on just the idea, we're switching gears a little bit. If you're going to talk about Reconstruction, you have to talk about the former slaves. I mean, that is the one group in our society that probably had the biggest adjustment to deal with. Going from being enslaved for generations to no longer being enslaved, instead being free. So you got to read a little bit about the real good side of this new adjustment, this new change in our country. And that is all these new freedoms that existed for former slaves that had never existed before. And that is a real positive thing. The fact that they could now start to get education, the fact that they could marry whoever they wanted, the fact that they could have families, the fact that they could choose their own place to live, their own work, their own, they could travel if they wanted. They didn't have to live under the rules of slavery, right? And that is all very positive and awesome. But there's a bad side to this newfound freedom that African Americans were trying to take advantage of. And that's part of what we're going to get into today. So what I have here is I just put these two statements here. There's a big difference between putting freedom and rights down on paper, like in the Constitution, in an amendment, saying it's one thing to write down in the constitutional amendment, the 15th Amendment, that yes, all African Americans are now citizens and have the rights of citizens. But it's a big difference between that and having freedom and rights in fact. And what I mean by that is that you can write it down on paper, but that doesn't mean that it's actually going to happen, right? So that's the side, kind of the bad, negative side of this new freedom that we're going to talk about today. All right, so this cartoon here, I think, does a really good job of illustrating what actually ends up happening during the Reconstruction years in terms of white Southerners and former slaves that had now been freed, right? And I'll get to the cartoon in a second. You can look at it as we're going through this, but I just have a few little, points here on the sides here. And to continue with what I had on the last slide there's a big, big difference between changing the laws, again, on paper, and changing people's minds. Just because the United States government, the radical Republican Constitution, says that, yes, African American people are now citizens, and they have all the rights that anybody in this country has, no matter what the color of their skin is, that's one thing to write a law that says that. But do you think that just automatically meant that for white people living in the South, they just said, oh, okay, well, they're equal now. They're the same as me. They deserve everything that I have. It's a little bit different when you're talking about trying to change somebody's mind about these kinds of things, right? So that's going to be an issue. A couple other things that should have happened or needed to happen but never did happen were just different things that probably were necessary for these former slaves to get on their feet and actually start enjoying the freedoms that they were now given by the Constitution. And one of the things that you read about with Thaddeus Stevens was this idea of land and land redistribution. What that meant was there were a lot of people in the country that said, you know what, when this war ended, what we should have done with all that land in the South was redistribute it to the people that deserve it. And the argument by many people was that the people that deserved to have that land were the former slaves. And the argument that people put out there and the former slaves put out there was this. Think about it this way. You have all these plantations and all this land in the South for generations now. Who worked the land for all these generations? It was the slaves, right? Who made the land fruitful? Well, it was the slaves. Who sweat and bled and cried on that land? Well, it was the slaves, right? Who made the land fruitful and profitable? It was the slaves working the land. Who got all of the profits from that work in that land? It was the white landowners. And so the argument was, you know what? This land is really ours, say the former slaves. We are the ones that have done all this. We are the ones that have made it fruitful and profitable, but yet we never got to enjoy any of that. So a lot of people said, what we should do is we should take all this land, divide it up, and give it to the former slaves so that they could have the land and live on it and work on it and start their new lives. Well, unfortunately, that never happened. As hard as the radical Republicans tried to do things in their plan, the one thing they never could do was push through this idea of land redistribution. And here's the reason why it's such a big deal. Think about trying to make money living in the southern part of the United States in the 1860s and 70s. What do you think you did for a living? Most people. You were a farmer. That was the agricultural part of our country. That's what people did, right? Well, okay, so you're a farmer. That's how you make money. Okay, so what do you need to be a farmer? The most important one thing you have to have, and that is land, right? If you don't have that, you can't be a farmer. Okay, so in order to make money in the South in the 1860s and 70s, you had to have a piece of land to farm on. That's how you made money, right? Well, how did you get a piece of land? You needed money to buy that land, right? Okay, so now we just need to get some money to buy some land, and then we'll be okay. Except, in order to get money, you need to have a piece of land to work on to make money. Okay, that's all right. Don't worry about it. Okay, so all we have to do is get a piece of land first, then, right? So, but wait, we need money to get the land. But we don't have any money unless we have, okay, you get the idea here. It was this real cyclical situation that the former slaves found themselves in. That's why they argued, listen, if you just give us a piece of land, land that we feel we deserve because we've worked on it and made it fruitful, then we can make money and start living our lives. It never happens. All of the land goes back to the white landowners. And that's an issue that never really gets resolved. Because of that, the former slaves will remain landless, they will remain moneyless, they will remain powerless, they will remain jobless, and so from there they got to try to figure it out. And then the other piece of this situation is just a little bit simpler than that. A lot of whites in the South just resorted to simple violence and intimidation to make sure that African Americans never got land and never got money and never got jobs and never got rights and never got freedoms. And so that's what this cartoon is trying to illustrate. This cartoon is made after the Civil War is over and slavery is abolished. But if you look at it, the title of the cartoon is worse than slavery. And it is because many people believe that this time period was actually worse than the slave period. And there are a lot of reasons for it. This cartoon illustrates some things about the Ku Klux Klan over here that we're going to get to later. It illustrates the power of white supremacy. You can see this guy's a member of the White League, and you can see the white standing tall and sort of hovering over top of the cartoon with the demonic smiley face here on the Ku Klux Klan member, while the former slaves are kind of cowering beneath them and low. You see this ominous image of someone hanging in a tree. You see a schoolhouse burning down here. And so this cartoon is trying to illustrate what the reality of the situation was. It gets us back to, it's one thing that changed the laws, but it's a different thing that changed the minds. Or if you go back here, the idea of having rights on paper versus having rights in fact. And what we're going to find out is the rights were written down on paper, but most African Americans had a very difficult time exercising those rights. And while we go through this period, while this is happening, and the whites in the South are trying to take advantage of the Reconstruction Plan and trying to make sure that they have the power and that African Americans are still weak, the powerful force that was the Radical Republican Congress ends up in the end really failing to make any real significant changes in the South after the war. And there's three things that are going to cause this failure to happen. One is that whites, and I've sort of alluded to it here already, they're going to start eventually, during the Reconstruction period, they're going to start fighting back against our government and against the plan for Reconstruction. They're just not going to take it, and they're going to fight this idea and resist this idea of giving African Americans rights and freedoms. A second thing that's going to happen that's going to cause this Reconstruction period to fail is that we're going to find out that these radical Republican politicians are going to get so mixed up in economic scandals, they're really going to start losing their focus on their original goals of punishing the South and guaranteeing rights for blacks, and instead they're going to start focusing on getting money in their pockets. And that's it. That's very sad. And then the third thing is very similar to the economic thing. Oh, let me get that right. They are going to get wrapped up in some political scandal. And instead of focusing again on their original goals of punishing the South and guaranteeing rights for African Americans, they're going to get too wrapped up in winning elections, keeping the power, staying in office, and you're going to see these political scandals unfold. And eventually, we're going to decide, and history has decided, that in many ways, the era of Reconstruction ends up being a big failure. And so I give you all of that as sort of a setup for the final part of this chapter, and that is the collapse of Reconstruction, or as I said in the last slide, a look at the failure of Reconstruction. I'm going to leave you to it, and you're going to be doing some reading in the book and answering some questions, and you're going to learn a little bit more about how this Reconstruction period ends up collapsing into a terrible failure. So this is not the positive side of the Reconstruction period. This is where we start getting into the negative side, where it starts to get really ugly for the former slaves. and really, really ugly for our entire country. So I'm going to let you get through Section 3 on your own, and I will talk to you again soon.